Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic of this webinar is Impacts of Federal Tax Credit Extensions on Renewable Deployment and Power Sector Emissions. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, for the State Federal RPS Collaborative. And we have a guest speaker with us today from NREL. And our host for this webinar is going to be Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and he also manages the State Federal RPS Collaborative. Before I pass it over to Warren, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode, so you have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using your telephone, or you can use your computer, mic, and speakers to connect the audio portion of the webinar. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will have a Q&A after our presentation. We'll answer as many questions as we can get to, but it's important that you type your questions in as you think of them. That way we are more likely to get to your question. We'll expect a lot of questions, so please type those in as you think of them. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You'll find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our previous webinars, on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And we'll also send you a follow-up email after the webinar with a link to the recording and the slides. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Well, this webinar, as Samantha did say, is being offered by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and other organizations that are working together to advance clean energy, and you could see logos of our various members around the country. And if we can go to the next slide, one of the projects we manage is the State Federal RPS Collaborative, which is an effort that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and it includes state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, basically anybody who's interested in renewable portfolio standards. We sponsor webinars. We have a monthly newsletter with news related to RPS matters around the country. We do joint projects and write papers, and if you want to get on the mailing list so that you find out about these RPS events, go to our website, www.cesa.org, and look for the State RPS Collaborative, and you can sign up for the webinar. If we can go to the next slide. So today we have a really interesting topic. Last year, one of the big topics of discussion and debate at the national level was whether the federal tax credits related to solar wind were going to be extended by Congress. We didn't know the answer to that question. Now we do. But there's then a new question, and that question is, well, what difference is that extension going to make? What are going to be the impacts for wind and solar deployment and costs? And luckily, the National Renewable Energy Lab recently came out with a very interesting paper on this topic, and we're going to hear about it today. And our guest speaker is going to be one of the authors of that paper. It's Trieu Mai, who's a senior energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory Strategic Energy Analysis Center. His research interests are in electric system modeling, economic and environmental impacts of different energy sources, clean energy policies, and renewable grid integration, particularly focusing on high renewable penetrations. He came to NREL back in 2009, and before that he worked in intellectual property law as a patent agent. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's a very smart guy, and he has some really interesting things to say today about our topic, so let's turn it over to him.
Okay, well, thanks to Warren and Sam for that introduction, and thanks to you all for listening in and giving us an opportunity to share some of the work we've done on this tax credit policy extension and their impacts. While I'm presenting today, I will have to acknowledge significant contributions from my co-authors, Wesley Cole, Eric Lance, Karen Marcy, and Ben Sigrin, as this work would not be possible without their efforts as well. Before going into the results of this analysis, and let me get to the next slide, I just do want to share kind of the presentation overview. We'll give a brief background on the tax credit policies, where it was and where it is today, some of the objectives of this study. In some ways, I just want to remind everyone that we are taking a narrow look at the impacts of the tax credit extensions. We'll briefly touch on the modeling methods and assumptions. In this webinar, you could find a more detailed explanation of that in the report shown on the right with the link on the lower right of the slide. And finally, we'll spend most of our time on the results. And the two particular results that we'll focus on is renewable deployment as a result of these tax credit extensions, and the power sector CO2 emissions impacts of the extensions as well. And then we will conclude. So before we go down to that agenda, I do want to acknowledge some other folks. This work was sponsored and funded by the Department of Energy, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Strategic Programs Office, and special thanks go to Steve Capana from that office, as he was a strong supporter of this analysis throughout. We also received funding from the Solar Energy Technologies and Wind and Water Power Technologies offices as well. So certainly we appreciate the support that all of these folks have given us. As I mentioned before, this work was executed by a number of folks listed there and listed in the title slide. What I do want to take a minute to describe is that we fit into a broader group, and this analysis is an example from a broader portfolio of policy analysis research that we conduct at NREL, and of course we also collaborate with many others. And this team at NREL is comprised of really an interdisciplinary group of folks, including renewable energy and policy analysts, economists, engineers, and energy modelers like myself. And this team tackles a broad set of issues listed below, including RPS issues, carbon policies, including the Clean Power Plan, and all, of course, with an emphasis on renewable energy and its impacts therein. Okay, so let's get started with some of the background information on the tax credit policies. This certainly will not be comprehensive, but it is a good thing to kind of lay down the groundwork. The wind production tax credit and solar investment tax credit, as many of you may know, were first enacted as part of the Energy Policy Acts of 1992 and 2005, respectively. And since then, the policies, particularly the wind PTC, has been expired, expended, modified, renewed numerous times, and you can see that in the arrows in the chart down below, indicating the periods of time in which the PTC was expired and then subsequently renewed or a new PTC was passed. And certainly, as you can see there, annual wind deployment shown in the blue bars correlates strongly with those changes to the PTC policy, indicating that at least historically, the PTC has significantly impacted wind deployment. And we look in our analysis now how that might change or not going forward. And another set of groundwork information that is good to know is before the passage of the Consolidated Appropriations Act at the end of last year, also known as the Omnibus Bill, that includes the recent tax credit extensions, the PTC for wind was expired. Actually, it was expired at the end of December in 2014, but it had a unique feature called the commence construction provision or under construction or start construction provision, which basically dictates that to qualify for the PTC, the project only needed to start construction during that deadline. For that reason, we have projects last year in 2015 and projects this year that likely qualify for the PTC, despite the fact that they won't start operations until after that expiration date. For the solar ITC, again, before the passage of this latest tax credit bill, the solar ITC at 30% was set to decline after 2016, going to 0% for residential solar projects and going down to 10% for commercial or other business utility scale projects. Now, moving forward to the current policy, and that's shown on the top set of rows in this table here, indicated as new policy, or what I will refer to as tax credit extension throughout this talk. That PTC and the solar ITC was extended through 2019 and through 2021, respectively. The couple of unique features are associated with this new tax credit policy, however. First, during the last few years through these periods, there is a ramp down period in which the PTC and ITC decline in value somewhat gradually instead of the larger step function of prior policies. And you can see the percent declines indicated in that table above. Secondly, the commence construction provision was extended not only to the PTC for wind, but also for the ITC, which is a difference from the prior policy. Finally, the PTCs were also extended for other renewable technologies beyond wind and solar, including biomass, geothermal, hydropower, and there were, of course, other nuances with the policy, like allowing for the ITC in lieu of the PTC for certain options as well. We don't focus on those, although they are included in our analysis. I will primarily focus on wind and solar, your utility scale wind, and the various solar technologies in this analysis. And I should have mentioned that when referred to full or 100% wind PTC, that's valued at 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 10 years of production. Okay, so now to the objective of our particular analysis. As I mentioned before, we are really focused on two specific questions: how RE deployment might be impacted by the federal tax credit extensions, and how this change in RE deployment might offset fossil generation and therefore impact carbon dioxide emissions in the power sector. Obviously, these two questions are somewhat narrow, and they do not include a broader set of issues that might relate to the tax credit extensions, including impacts to taxpayers or ratepayers, or impacts to compliance costs of other policies like state RPS or like carbon policies such as the Clean Power Plan. As such, this analysis really does not represent a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of the tax credit extensions, although I will note that that first question in particular will drive many of the other impacts of the policy. So in some ways, it is a foundational and fundamental question that one needs to answer to do that more comprehensive analysis. I'll skip this in the interest of time. We'll get back to that, but it does summarize our results, and we'll return to the slide at the very end. And as I mentioned before, the report details our methods and assumptions in great detail, so I will only skirt through them here. The only thing I will note in this slide is that we use two modeling tools from NREL, and this analysis is fundamentally a modeling exercise. The two tools are the Regional Energy Deployment System, or REDS model, and the Distributed Solar model. Both of them are really designed to produce future scenarios of not just renewable, but the power sector at large in the United States through 2050, although in our analysis here we'll focus only on results through 2030. REDS looks at all utility scale generation technologies and is supplemented with D-Solar that focuses solely on the rooftop PV market. And we've used this framework to assess a wide range of future scenarios focused on wind and solar as part of the Wind Vision study that some of you may be familiar with, released last year, and the Sunshot Vision study, and a broader renewable electricity future study from 2012. We've also used this kind of modeling framework to assess policies in prior years as well, including looking at the wind PTC extension, and we've started to look at the impacts of the Clean Power Plan using this modeling framework as well. Some of the key assumptions, and again, I won't go into detail here in this webinar, but you can find them in the report and the underlying cited data references, include the NREL 2015 annual technology baseline for many of our renewable cost and performance assumptions. Some of that data is reflected in the chart below for utility PV and wind. And then the other key data source that we use is EIA's annual energy outlook, both for the non-renewable technology assumptions as well as demand growth and fuel prices. And we'll get into specifics about fuel prices in the next couple of slides. We do in this analysis include all of the major energy policies that were in existence as of January of this year, including all of the state RPS, regional and national carbon emissions policies. For the Clean Power Plan in particular, we model a somewhat simplified compliance scenario of the Clean Power Plan in which it's mass-based compliance, i.e. a carbon cap for each state, but allow for full credit trading between the states. Across all of these policies, I would just note that the focus is really on the impacts of the tax credit. We didn't look at the full set of interactions between the tax credits and these other policies. In other words, how it might impact compliance costs or compliance in these other policies, nor did we span the full spectrum of sensitivities across these other policies, such as different compliance scenarios for the CPP. So that's just important to note the scope of this work and thereby the potential limitations of the analysis. These are the four scenarios that we evaluate in this analysis. There are variants in terms of extensions that EXT describes scenarios that include the recent renewable tax credit extensions, and then no EXT represents essentially the prior policy. And differences between the extension and no extension are what we define as incremental RE, which is in a positive. When it's positive, indicates that with extensions there's greater RE deployment. And avoided CO2, which when it's positive indicates that there were greater emissions in the no extension versus the extension scenario. In all the charts you'll see the no extension scenario will be indicated by the dotted line, while the extension scenarios will be indicated by the solid lines. We also span a range of future natural gas price trajectories. In our what we call our base gas price scenarios, we use the AEO reference scenario indicated by the red colors, and you'll see that in the charts as well. And then we also look at a lower gas price scenario based on the AEO's high oil and gas resource scenario and indicated by the blue. And of course, the reason why we look at a range of natural gas price trajectories is that natural gas price has historically been very difficult to predict, so we figured that it was best to cover the range instead of looking at a single isolated future trajectory. And the chart on the right there, it gives an indication of the range that our analysis spans in terms of natural gas prices, down from delivered prices of approximately $4 to $4.50 per million BTU across all years to in the reference or base gas price trajectory with increasing prices up to about $6.50 per million BTU. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide either, but the report does describe a number of limitations and caveats. The only two that I'll mention here is This, again, is a modeling exercise, so it doesn't account for all the difficult-to-model items, including some of the local decision-making factors, non-economic choices, some of the pipeline and supply chain impacts, and how the tax credits might impact those. And also technology learning is an important one. We apply the same cost and performance assumption trajectory for all the scenarios, with and without the extensions. So in some ways, all else being equal, since we don't model technology learning endogenously, our impacts that we quantify likely are understated from that perspective. But again, that does assume that all else is equal under our set of assumptions. Okay, now with that background in mind, let's jump into the results. So starting off, this chart shows renewable deployment in terms of generating capacity in gigawatts from 2000 to 2014. When I say renewables, that includes wind and solar, hydropower, geothermal, and biomass in aggregate. And what we found should be well known to perhaps many of you is renewable growth, particularly wind and solar growth, has accelerated significantly over the past 5 to 10 years. If you look at the numbers, the annual deployment rates for renewables from 2001 to 2010 is roughly 4 gigawatts per year. In the last 5 years that at least we had data at the time of this analysis, which is 2010 to 2014, that annual growth rate increased to about 10.6 gigawatts per year. By year-end 2014, the total aggregate renewable capacity was approximately 184 gigawatts. So that's the context for which we will start looking at how the tax credits might impact future renewable deployment. So starting with the base gas price scenario, what we find is absent the tax credit extensions, renewable growth is estimated to slow during the next 5 years through 2020. And that slowdown results in about 8 gigawatts per year of annual renewable deployment compared to that 10.5 number for the prior 5 years. But what we find is after 2020, renewable growth, at least based on the assumptions that we use, does grow significantly such that by 2030, aggregate RE installed capacity reaches about 450 gigawatts. And some of the reasons for this growth that is beyond even historical growth and certainly beyond the 8 gigawatts that we are estimating for this scenario for the next 5 years is due to a combination of decreasing RE costs based on our assumptions and based on what we've observed historically, increasing natural gas prices. Again, this is the base gas price scenario, so as I indicated earlier, gas prices grow to approximately $6.50 per million BTU. And then finally, the policy demand for new clean energy, both state RPSs, but also, and perhaps in principle, the Clean Power Plan over this time period of the 2020s. Now, when we layer on the tax credit extension, what we find is that near-term renewable deployment receives a significant boost. In fact, during this next 5-year period, we estimate that nearly 19 gigawatts per year of renewable capacity will be installed from 2016 to 2020. That's a significant increase compared to the no extension scenario or to the prior 5 years. In fact, that average annual rate even exceeds the record rate, at least through 2014, of approximately 17.5 gigawatts per year found in 2012. However, we find that this near-term boost, and sorry, one more note is we find that by 2022, the incremental RE of the extension scenario relative to the no extension scenario is approximately 53 gigawatts at its peak. But we find that after that 2022 period, the installed renewable actually starts to converge to the no extension scenario, such that by 2030 we find very little difference in installed capacity between the two scenarios, both reaching about 450 gigawatts. In other words, we find that in the base gas price scenario, the tax credits accelerate that renewable deployment, but that renewable capacity might already or might be built later on, even absent the extensions. Now, layering on the impacts of the extensions to the lower gas price scenarios, we find very similar results in the near term, such that renewable deployment grows by about 16 gigawatts per year over the next 5 years with the extension, which is roughly twice as rapid as in the no extension scenario. And we also find that in an environment where gas prices are lower and renewable generation might be less competitive, the overall amount of renewables is lower than under the gas price scenario. However, a key qualitative difference is found in this low gas price scenario, in that in the long term, we still find that the renewable tax credit extensions, the impacts of them are longer lasting. In other words, if you look through 2030, the extension scenario yields, in this case, 36 gigawatts greater renewable capacity even through 2030, compared to in the base gas price scenario where there was essentially no difference whether or not you had the tax credit extensions. So that is one difference. And the meaning of this is really that under an environment where renewables perhaps are less economically competitive, the tax credit extensions may be a more important policy driver, which is quite intuitive. We also assess these tax credit impacts across the different renewable technologies. In these two charts, I show solar and wind capacity across the 4 scenarios, respectively. We do share the results of the other renewable technologies in the report as well. Overall, what we find is solar capacity growth across all 4 scenarios really is quite consistent over time, at least based on our assumptions and methodology. And we find that the tax credit-driven incremental solar capacity is greatest during the early 2020s at roughly 16 to 20 gigawatts of extra solar capacity that one might install as a result of the tax credit extensions. For wind, we find certainly that the future installation of wind is much more sensitive to tax credits in the near term in particular, and much more sensitive in the long term with respect to gas prices. And you can see that in the right-hand chart there. There's a much wider gap between the dotted and solid lines, and a wider gap between the blue and the red compared to solar. In fact, we find that by 2020, the incremental wind capacity that's driven by the tax credit could be up to 45 gigawatts in the base gas scenario and 29 gigawatts in the lower gas price scenarios. Nonetheless, as you might expect, our analysis shows that wind and solar are estimated to experience the most growth over the next 15 years, and the tax credits have the greatest impact on these two technologies. I will skip over this, but just to mention that we also estimate renewable generation and penetration across the scenarios and an impact of the tax credits. Not surprisingly, the trends in generation are largely aligned with the trends in capacity that we discussed earlier. Of course, the only thing that we might note here is that across all scenarios and really all years, wind and hydropower make up the largest share amongst the different renewable technologies, and wind and solar experience the most growth in generation, at least in absolute terms, compared to the other technologies. And that's not surprising, again, because of the cost assumptions that are used, the resources that are available for those two technologies, and the fact that the tax credits are give the most value to wind and solar compared to the other renewable technologies. And finally, the last set of results will be on power sector CO2 emissions, and they start out with a similar look at the historical power sector emissions over the last 15 years. And you might notice a trend, or you might know that the trend since 2005 or since 2007 has generally been a decline in power sector or really economy-wide emissions. That decline is driven by a combination of three key factors: coal to gas switching, which due to the lower natural gas prices that we've seen during that time period has really shown a sea change in the amount of coal generation relative to gas. Increased renewable and energy efficiency deployment has also led to this reduction in power sector emissions. And the Great Recession, of course, has also dropped consumption and therefore dropped overall emissions in the power sector. Now, what we find looking forward or prospectively is that absent the tax credit extension, we actually see a slight increase or uptick in emissions, such that by 2020, emissions in the power sector is approximately 13% below 2005 levels. After that period of time, we find that the CPP in these base gas price scenarios sets somewhat of a floor on emissions, such that by 2030, emissions reach about 32% below 2005 levels. Now again, when we layer on the tax credit extensions and the incremental renewable deployment that we discussed previously, we do find an emissions reductions benefit associated with that incremental RE. In other words, that incremental RE did displace fossil generation, in these cases primarily natural gas generation, and therefore yielded emissions reductions, such that by 2020, power sector emissions were approximately 19% below 2005 levels. But after that 2020 period, again, the CPP really becomes the primary driver of power sector emissions, and therefore the emissions in both the no extension and extension scenarios are very similar between 2022 and 2030, reaching 32% below 2005 levels by 2030. In the low gas price scenarios, we see actually significantly different behavior. In particular, in the near term, what we find is that coal to gas switching accelerates, resulting in an even sharper drop in emissions reductions than the base gas price scenario, and then really compared to the historical trends over the past 15 years. Such that by 2020, we find that independent of the tax credit, emissions dip to 28 to 33% below 2005 levels in 2020. And we also find that emissions reductions decreases the impact of other policies in terms of emissions going forward, and such that in the extension scenario, emissions actually go to 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. This next chart summarizes the prior charts in a little bit different way. In this case, we look at avoided emissions on an annual basis on the left and on a cumulative since 2016 basis, or from 2016 basis on the right. As indicated earlier, under the base gas price scenarios, nearly all of those avoided emissions occur before 2022, resulting in cumulative through 2030 emissions reductions of about 540 million metric tons of CO2. Under the low gas price scenario, we find that the peak avoided emissions, annual avoided emissions, are lower than the base gas price annual avoided emissions, but those emissions reductions benefits extend for a longer period of time and actually extend through 2030, such that cumulative emissions under the low gas scenario actually is significantly larger than under the base gas price scenario and totals about 1,400 million metric tons. Of course, all these emissions benefits estimates of the tax credits can be sensitive to the CPP compliance scenario, and we've really only looked at one of them, and we do mention that in the report as well, so that is an important note to take. So that concludes the primary results of our analysis. To summarize, what we find is that under a range of natural gas price assumptions, scenarios with the tax credit extensions certainly do show a greater amount of renewable investment, particularly through the 2020s, compared to scenarios with the prior policy only. We find that this peak impact totals about 50 gigawatts, or more accurately 48 to 53 gigawatts by the early 2020s. That's either in 2020 or 2022. But the longer-term impacts in terms of incremental renewable deployment is less certain and can depend on natural gas prices. And we find that longer-lasting impacts of the tax credits are found when gas prices are low. And solar and wind are estimated to experience the most growth in the near term and are most impacted by the tax credits amongst all of the other, all of the renewable technologies. And finally, we see that tax credit-driven acceleration of renewable capacity can reduce fossil generation and thereby lower CO2 emissions, yielding cumulative CO2 reductions ranging from 540 million metric tons in the base gas price scenario to 1,400 million metric tons in the low gas price scenario. And that concludes my part of the webinar. The report can be found in the link you see there, and I'm happy to answer questions now or via email. And I'll turn it back to you, Warren.
Sorry, I was on mute, but I'm not any longer. And there are a number of questions people wrote in. I will be asking those, but there's still opportunity to write in some more questions. I'd also like to point out to a couple people, I wrote back privately to you asking you to rephrase your question because I wasn't able to understand it the first time around. So if you can do that, that would be great. In any case, the first thing I want to ask, and this is combining two questions. One is, do you have a theory for why wind is so much more sensitive to the tax credits than solar? And then someone else wrote, in part with a theory, how much of the difference between the impact on wind and solar of the tax credit extension is a result of different modeling for residential solar?
Yeah, those are good questions and good insights as well. We do describe this to some degree in our report. But one of the reasons that there might be a difference in terms of sensitivity between wind and solar to the tax credit is the nature of the tax credits themselves. So the wind tax credit, PTC, is a production one, so the value of it will depend on obviously the production or the capacity factor of wind. Under our assumptions, the performance of wind increases over time. In other words, it has higher capacity factor in the future than it does today, and therefore the value of the PTC, at least based on our assumptions, would correspondingly increase over time as well. In converse, or for solar, the ITC is an investment tax credit, and under our assumptions and what has been experienced over recent years is a significant decrease in capital costs for solar projects, particularly for PV, in which case the value of the ITC actually declines over time as the capital cost for solar gets cheaper and cheaper. So there is an inherent difference in how those tax credits manifest themselves in terms of their value to the different technologies. Secondly, wind and solar also have a different resource curve. In other words, the wind resources and solar resources are both, of course, tremendously large. However, they are both, dependent on the location and the resource availability. And since wind has a larger starting point, there's approximately 75 gigawatts of wind installed to 20-something gigawatts of solar, and the corresponding larger resource availability of solar, those lowest hanging fruit has already been tapped in to wind, and therefore the more sensitive future deployment will depend on how those higher up in the supply curve of solar and wind respectively get tapped into and the value of the tax credits therein. And finally, to the other comment about residential versus utility scale wind and solar, the residential sector, at least how we've modeled it and possibly in the real world, is perhaps less sensitive to some of these factors, some of the market factors that we modeled with respect to gas prices and other things, as they're really competing with retail rates that only indirectly get impacted by these other market factors. So we do find that the residential PV sector is less sensitive to the tax credits and to other market factors than we do for wind.
Very good. And can you give a general sense of how the D-Solar model works?
Yeah, the D-Solar model is a consumer adoption model that looks at a set of payback for different commercial and industrial and residential rooftop PV consumers or customers, and then does its adoption prediction based on those economics for those individual consumers. It is highly disaggregated with high spatial resolution down to the county level and does a pretty detailed assessment of different rooftop potential. And then on top of it, it does a diffusion behavior where adopters diffuse within the different market sectors correspondingly. So I'm certainly not an expert on the D-Solar side, but it's a Bass diffusion model that does look at these different payback curves.
Okay, and one person wrote in saying, it's counterintuitive that low gas prices imply a larger drop in CO2 emissions over time to 2030. Could you explain why lower gas prices lead to a larger impact of the tax credit extension?
Sure. So there are two things going on, or more than two things, but I think what the questioner is implying is that low gas price might make it more difficult, and it does, for renewable deployment because it's less competitive for renewables in that case. But there's other impacts as well that part of the equation misses, in that there's also competition between gas generation and coal generation. And what we find is that latter impact is larger than the renewable versus gas question. In other words, what we're finding in our low gas scenario is that the generation cost for primarily existing gas is lower even than the generation gas for existing coal, and such that the gas generation in that case is displacing more coal than the renewable generation is displacing gas in the reference or base gas price case. And hence we find that at least over the period of time that this analysis looks at through 2030, with low gas prices, you do get lower emissions and greater emissions impact of the tax credits as well. Beyond 2030, although we don't report any of the results in the report, I would say that eventually, as both those gas prices increase even in the low gas scenario, and as the mix of generation has already displaced a significant amount of coal, then the flip side does occur, in which lower gas prices could yield larger emissions. So there's a temporal aspect as well.
Okay, and this is a question having to do with the decision not to count technology learning. There's such a dramatic difference in the amount of renewables deployment in the first 5 years that you're looking at with the tax credit extension than without it. One would assume the solar and wind industry would be growing so much faster under the tax credit extension scenario that there would be significant efficiencies and cost improvements built into those two industries. And given that, shouldn't that make wind and solar better able to compete after the first 5 years than in a scenario where you don't have the tax credits, and therefore shouldn't you get some continued benefit from that?
Yep, I certainly agree with that conceptually, and I think there's two aspects that relates to. There's technology learning, the fundamental equipment itself, and I would say that might be mitigated, or that shortcoming of our approach might be mitigated through the fact that the wind and solar industries are global in nature, and therefore the incremental impact that the tax credits in the U.S. market might impact the technology learning globally might be somewhat more reduced than what is implied by that question. But there is certainly could be an impact on the supply chain and the soft cost side of learning that our analysis doesn't capture. So that's why I noted early on in the presentation that we acknowledge that shortcoming, and we acknowledge that, perhaps taking into account that learning should be considered, or taking into account how the supply chain might be impacted should be considered as well in future work. And in some ways, therefore, the incremental impact of the tax credit might be taken as a floor in this analysis, although it kind of depends on what you assume or what your perspectives are on how optimistic or pessimistic we might be with our non-learning assumptions. I would also add that we don't model some of the other impacts that rapid growth in renewables might have on the supply chain, or how the supply chain might limit the rapid growth that we project for the next 5 years. So in that sense, it could also, not as a function of learning, but as an assumption of, or as an impact of the supply chain, that we might be overestimating the impact of the tax credits, because there might be other bottlenecks in the industry that our modeling doesn't capture as well.
That's certainly fair enough. Let's talk about some other technologies. One person was asking, well, where do geothermal and grid technology fit into the equation? And someone else asked, from the analysis you did, can you speculate as to what the effect would be of an extension of the tax credit to other technologies that CHP weren't extended, if there was a extension for those technologies?
Sure. So spanning the scope of the other technologies, first I'll start with the ones that we did model. We did include the PTC extension through 2016 for biopower, hydropower, and geothermal, which also includes a commenced construction provision. What we find is that short PTC extension did accelerate geothermal by a small measure in the very near term. And we were talking about, a couple hundred megawatts of incremental geothermal capacity over by 2018, then without the extensions. However, what we find is that the incremental impact of wind and solar is so much greater that in the longer term, i.e. beyond 2018, it actually depresses geothermal deployment because wind and solar are more competitive and take up more market share than geothermal's growth. However, we do find that in the very long term, by 2030, that geothermal capacity that is reduced in the near term does eventually get deployed, and geothermal does experience the same, essentially, amount of growth by 2030. And we find very little sensitivity in all the scenarios to hydropower and biopower deployment, and very little deployment as well in those two technologies. In terms of the technologies that are the other tax credits included or not in the extension, we didn't evaluate how technologies that are not covered by tax credit extensions might be impacted. such as CHP. We do note that in our analysis and our methods, the REEDS and desolar models actually do not cover CHP and other distributed generation, and therefore it's largely just outside of the scope of what we look at. And in terms of grid technologies, I skipped over that slide, the slide about generation somewhat briefly, but we do find that by 2030, in the base gas scenarios, renewable generation reaches about 33% on an annual basis nationwide. Of course, about 10% of that is from hydropower, biomass, and geothermal, so really it's only 23% from wind and solar. We don't find a significant amount of need, even in that higher penetration case, of a substantial amount of quote-unquote grid support. And I don't know what the reader really means, but certainly we do find some incremental transmission expansion is needed, and we find limited amount of storage deployment under those scenarios, but not by any large-scale measure.
Okay, and here's a couple questions having to do with net metering. One of the early slides showed the resource for net metering assumptions, and this person wants to know, was that desolar? And could you confirm the source? Also, was net metering for behind-the-meter solar PV assumed to stay the same through the whole period through 2030, or did you assume there would be any net metering changes during that entire period?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is referring to the assumptions in desolar. Of course, net metering is not factored in directly in the REEDS analysis at all, but net metering is considered in the economics analysis and payback analysis within desolar to make its adoption decisions. And how we did that was we tried to replicate the net metering policies as they're currently, or as of October of last year, implemented. So what that means is states with a net metering cap, we projected when those caps would be hit, and what we did was we made an assumption that after the caps are hit, that net metered electricity will be valued at our estimated wholesale prices instead of full retail net metering. Obviously, that's not consistent with the recent changes or within, for example, California's net metering policy, and on the other side, doesn't fully capture the changes in, for example, Nevada's net metering policy. So in some ways, that analysis is dated because some of those important changes have not been captured. But we didn't assume that, the upshot is we didn't assume that net metering will persist forever in those states. We did reduce the net metering policy based on that conservative assumption of valuing that electricity at wholesale rates instead of retail rates. I would note that we did some analysis subsequently looking at the impacts of these changes to net metering policies, and we have not found a significant amount of sensitivity in the desolar model, at least from a nationwide deployment perspective, based on those changes in policy.
I have a couple questions that have to do with how you deal with variables that have to do with political changes that are very hard to model. And the first is, what is your assumption about the Clean Power Plan in the period 2022 to 2024? The other one, what's your assumption about changes in presidential administrations and the stance of presidential administration toward renewable energy and climate change impacts?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I'll tackle the first one because it's easier for me to answer. We model the Clean Power Plan based on a set of very simplifying assumptions. We do include the CPP regulation from 2022 through 2030, based on these mass-based compliance targets that were set by EPA for the power sector by state. And we do assume, and this is a simplifying assumption, full credit trading between states. So the carbon caps effectively are just applied and the states, but since there's full credit trading, really it is effectively a nationwide cap is met in the model. We don't model the impacts of the Clean Energy Incentive Program that would offer incentives to early action for renewables and energy efficiency in particular, and therefore, or to wind and solar, I should say, and therefore that might understate the impacts of the CPP in those very early years in particular. To the latter question, we make no assumptions about future political decisions or changes as a result of administration changes or anything like that. Our analysis reflects existing policies as they were as of January of this year. And so if the policy is on the books, we represent it. If it's not, we don't project any new policy. Of course, the Clean Power Plan is a question given the stay from the Supreme Court, but I would note that the Supreme Court did not overturn the rule, and so we do include it in our analysis as an existing regulatory policy.
Good. I have just one more question, and then I could give you a couple of minutes to say anything you might want to say that you didn't get a chance to say. And this question goes to the Clean Power Plan. I certainly understand why you took the approach you took in terms of modeling the Clean Power Plan and including that in your analysis. Can you speculate if states take a less efficient approach in terms of their choices about Clean Power Plan implementation, in which direction would that likely lead your results? Would that likely lead your results to a greater impact of the tax credit extensions or a smaller impact of the tax credit extensions?
Sure, that's a good question. So we didn't really comprehensively look at this, so I can only provide a partial answer. One thing that we did evaluate is a Clean Power Plan scenario in which trading was more restricted, and this is noted in a footnote in the report, and we find that the impact of the tax credit extensions are greater under the low gas price scenario in that case, as you know, it impacts different states individually as compared to kind of more of a nationwide perspective with the full trading assumption. So that's one small bit. We have not looked at the rate versus mass questions. We did not look at other kind of trading scenarios with respect to the Clean Power Plan. But it does perhaps indicate that the impact of the tax credits may be more important with different Clean Power Plan compliance scenarios, but we certainly don't have the definitive answer to that.
And is there anything else you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say up till now?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to share this work, and we appreciate everyone listening in.
Hey, I want to really sincerely thank you for this, and I bet everyone on the line wants to thank you as well for the unusual clarity of your explanations and for your candor in terms of discussing both the limitations of your analysis as well as the considerable strengths of this very important recent report. As we said at the beginning of the hour, the recording of this webinar and the slides will be up on the Clean Energy States Alliance website starting tomorrow, and anybody could go find them there. Thank you very much, Trieu, for taking the time to share your work with us.
Oh, thank you.